Let's learn some philosophy from some memes. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. So here we have a meme by Traditional Depth 6924, and it's the big strong dog and the slightly more pathetic dog, and it's philosophers then, and the strong dog reads, "I laid the groundwork of sciences and shaped the worldview of our time," and then it's philosophers now, and it's the scrawny dog, and it reads, "I comment on past people's texts, therefore I am." I kind of sympathize with bits of this meme, right? Because in modern philosophy, there aren't many grand treatises in the same way that there used to be, even like 100 years ago. I think that the most recent work of philosophy that I would describe, at least, as a really big grand treatise of, trying to unify metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of language might be something like Robert Brandam's Making It Explicit. I have tried to read Making It Explicit a number of times. I'm kind of gearing up to give it another go. Very difficult book. I've recently got a kind of study guide thing that I'm gonna read along with it because it is very, very intense and difficult. I actually got panned by one of the professors at my old university, but I'm kind of quite bullish on any philosopher that tries to craft a grand treatise, and so I really do want to get to grips with it. But yes, the majority of academic philosophy does consist in these slightly smaller scale problems. However, I would push back on the idea that this is never useful, right? Partly because academic philosophers don't just comment on what past philosophers have said. A really good modern philosopher working in the philosophy of science is Massimo Pigliucci, and I'm terribly sorry if you're watching, Dr. Pigliucci, because I've probably just completely butchered your name. He writes on the philosophy of science and pseudoscience, and more recently has done some pop philosophy work in ancient philosophy, things like Stoicism. He's brilliant, kind of really making new strides in the demarcation problem, which is the problem of defining science and separating it from non-science and pseudoscience, and just generally in characterizing science and what makes a kind of rigorous scientific epistemology and a rigorous scientific philosophy of language. So I would push back on the idea that all modern philosophers do is comment on past philosophers. However, I also do want to defend work that does comment on past philosophers. I mean, I kind of have to. A lot of my work on the channel is pop philosophical reflections on past philosophical giants. And part of the reason why I think that's important is that it's not because I think there's necessarily an inherent good in learning what Kierkegaard thought about something or something like that. Like, I find that personally interesting, but I don't think I think that's more the history of ideas than kind of philosophy proper. I do, however, think that reading some of these absolute philosophical giants of the past can help us to kind of clarify and or inspire our own thinking. So have read an awful lot of Nietzsche, an awful lot of secondary scholarship on Nietzsche. I don't agree with a lot of what I take Nietzsche to have said, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that aspects of his philosophy are very useful and that aspects of his philosophy are true, but also reading Nietzsche has helped me clarify some of my own ideas. I mean, take something like, I know Brian Leiter has an interpretation of Nietzsche that's very sort of proto-naturalist. And in doing that, in Leiter's interpretation of Nietzsche and in me kind of reading that and wrestling a bit with that, it's allowed me to see Nietzsche in a new light, which connects it to quite a lot of modern philosophy that I'm interested in. Things like Hugh Price's subject naturalism and some modern philosophy of science that focuses specifically on the human. And so, that's an example of where going back and learning about an older philosopher has encouraged the development of my own thinking and helped me make links between aspects of modern philosophy and modern philosophical problems and the problems of the past. So that's one reason I think that it is worth getting to grips with some of these older thinkers. Another reason is just that philosophy is sort of a bit like a conversation extended over thousands and thousands of years. If you're, for example, reading Nietzsche and, you kind of have no idea what Plato said, for example, then there are going to be elements of Nietzsche that are going to be quite difficult because, Nietzsche sometimes explicitly sets up aspects of his philosophy in opposition to things like the Platonic tradition. And so it can become difficult without kind of knowing anything about past philosophy to really get the most out of that. So that's another reason. Another, much more down-to-earth reason is just that modern philosophers and whatever philosophy you happen to be interested in will almost certainly reference past philosophers. It'll be easier to understand what they're saying in a very kind of first-order, ground-level way if you have some kind of familiarity with the philosophers of the past. But to be honest, the main reason why I like talking about great philosophers from years gone by on the channel is that I really do think that in engaging with these works, we can aid our own thinking and the development of our own thinking. My ultimate hope for those videos is that people are deeply unsatisfied with simply watching some British guy on a computer screen talk about, Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or Dostoevsky or Camus, and that they feel like, no, I need to go away and read these thinkers for myself. And it's one of the reasons why I kind of open a lot of those videos by saying, this is just my interpretation. You shouldn't take this as gospel. It's because I think that ultimately the value in the kind of videos that I make, if there is any, is going to be in the way that it hopefully gets people engaging with the actual text of these thinkers. Yeah, I think there are plenty of reasons to read old philosophers. However, yeah, I would push back on the idea that is all that modern philosophy consists of. But, I don't think there's any harm in modern philosophy consisting, at least partly, of that. Another really interesting leveret that this meme got me thinking about is that one of my friends or kind of acquaintances is very, very into Eastern philosophy, more so than I am. I'm a really big fan of aspects of Buddhist philosophy that I think is really often caricatured in a lot of popular discourse. And I should probably make a video on that at some point. He's really into kind of post-Confucianist Chinese thinkers and all sorts. Very, very clever guy. And something that he was talking to me about is that a lot of these thinkers, they will write their own philosophy, but then hide it within a commentary of a previous philosopher. And it reminds me a little bit of how you'll sometimes get theologians doing this in the Christian tradition. You read someone like St. Thomas Aquinas kind of forcing Aristotelian philosophy into scripture. And you'll think, there's a sense in which maybe that's in scripture, but also, this is Aquinas downplaying the amount to which he is originating and developing his own thought. So that, I think that that's another thing worth being aware of, is that sometimes, and, I would say that even a lot of modern Western scholarship on highly interpretable thinkers like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or Heidegger are often at least partly doing their own philosophy as well. I'm reading a book called Nietzsche's System by John Richardson, who's a kind of metaphysical Nietzsche scholar in a way that, I have tended to read more psychological or human-focused accounts of Nietzsche's philosophy, and I wanted to branch out. And in the introduction to this book, he basically says, this is partly a book about Nietzsche, but it's partly a book about using Nietzsche to make real advances in the way that we see the world and interpret metaphysical claims. I thought, that is in the spirit of a lot of these theologians, or if my friend is to be believed, a lot of these kind of post-Confucian Chinese philosophers, where it looks like a commentary on an older text, and to a certain extent it is, but it is also substantive new philosophy being done using that material. So I think you can do a lot with commenting on old texts, although, as I said, and as I always say, don't just take what a thinker believed in the past as read. But anyway, moving on. But before we move on, making sense of the serious study of philosophy memes requires critical thinking and logic skills, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like science, maths, and programming can be very difficult. These subjects can get unintuitive very quickly, which often presents real challenges for students. But this is where Brilliant comes into play. They have courses on a wide range of topics, from programming with functions to probability theory to learning the ins and outs of large language models or classical mechanics, with each one crafted by award-winning research teams. Additionally, Brilliant's learning is based around completing activities, so you can learn by putting things into practice, which both improves retention and just stops things getting boring. It can also reduce your social media doom scrolling, since with their app, you can complete lessons or exercises on the go rather than spending the afternoon getting involved in some Twitter flame war. If you want to improve your own critical thinking skills, then you should check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will just let you see what logic is all about. And with even a little bit of logic, the world is a whole lot clearer. A friend of mine also gives his personal recommendation for Brilliant's calculus puzzles. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice, scan the QR code on screen, or use the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. So please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. Okay, next up we have a meme by Grayley, and it's called The Socratic Method, and it's two people having a conversation, and one of them says, "You should read philosophy books. Have you even read Plato?" And the person replies, "Isn't Phaedrus the one where Socrates says philosophy shouldn't be written down?" And then the person gets a little bit cross. This is a very interesting part of Plato's dialogues. If I recall correctly, and I haven't gone back and checked, so I hope I've recalled correctly, Plato's Socrates gives two primary points about philosophy being written down and why he doesn't like it. The first is that it degrades the memory. So, this idea that, okay, why would you bother committing things to long-term memory when you can just write them down and revisit them later? The faintest ink is better than the best memory, or whatever that phrase is. Ironically, I can't remember how that phrase goes. So do correct me in the comments. But Socrates worries that if you write down philosophy, you're going to end up in a situation where people just, they don't remember these ideas, they don't internalize them properly, they just refer back to their notebooks, His other point is that, philosophy is kind of a living thing. He's worried about when philosophy gets written down, it becomes kind of stagnant and dead. You can't have a conversation with a book in the, literal sense. People say you can metaphorically have conversations with books, but you can't actually, if I talk to my, collection of Kafka's shorts, Metamorphosis and other stories, it will not talk back to me, no matter how hard I try. And I've tried. I obviously disagree with this general idea that writing things down and reading philosophy is a bad idea. But I do think that these are still good points. So I've talked on the channel before about how important I think memorization is and how underrated I think it is as an idea. And it's not because I think rote memorization is good for its own sake. It's because when you commit something to memory, it's in your head and you can take it with you anywhere you go, So whenever I'm writing a video and I'm kind of engaging with a particularly difficult text, in theory, I try and memorize 3 points from every book I read, the 3 main points from that book. And I'm less consistent with that than I ought to. But if I have a very difficult book and I'm working on a video and I just can't figure out what to do with these ideas. By far the longest part of my video making process is the bit after I finish doing my reading for the video, and I'm just I have the ideas there, but they don't quite slot together in the right way yet. Normally, I will finish reading for a video a solid month before I write it. And, the actual writing process, once I have the idea, doesn't take that long, so I'm quite a fast writer. But that sitting with the idea and sort of figuring out what you're going to do with it and kind of trying to tease out its internal parts, that's it's the best part, don't get me wrong. It is also the most frustrating part. And one of the things I found that really helps with that is memorizing, not bits of the text verbatim, but the main points of a text. It's up there so you can start playing around with it. This allows you to tease through the ideas when you're going on a walk, or you're getting a train ride somewhere, or you're laying awake at night, being, kept awake by different interpretations of Nietzsche or what Kierkegaard said in the present age or something like that. So that's one reason why I think memorization, the memorization of things in books does really have its place. And so I do see where Socrates is coming from there. Obviously, I just think that you can have both. But it is, I don't know if anyone's written anything down on this. I suppose, ironically, they probably can't have done if you're trying to measure the effect of the widening use of writing within a society and how that affects the memory. That feels like the kind of study you could only really conduct once you've already reached quite the advanced stage of written communication. But it'd be interesting to see if actually memory does degrade with the easier access people have to information. I worry about this with things like Google and obviously things like ChatGPT, where people, if you have easy information just there, will people just be tempted to just never remember things and never have, because as I say, remembering things, not saying that rote memorization is great for its own sake, but remembering things is a really important part of learning something in depth. Whether you do it actively by using a memory palace technique, or whether you just are so engaged with an idea that it just sticks in your head, having the idea just locked into your own mind is very helpful for I think, for gaining a deeper understanding of something. The other part of Socrates' point, I think, is also very important. This idea that philosophy is something that is undergone by breathing people, breathing minds in conversation with one another. I think that a lot of philosophy today loses some of that. I mean, you get it at conferences and stuff. When I was doing my master's, I was lucky enough to to chair a couple of presentations at a conference, and that was great because it was actually thrilling. I was surrounded by all these academics who knew so much more than me about topics. I would just be there to kind of make sure that the debate and the discussions stayed orderly in terms of not running over. Not orderly in terms, like, nobody was rude, obviously. It's like a bunch of academics in a room. And there was something really special about watching and, in my own small way, taking part in those conversations. I am such a big fan of philosophical dialogue partaken in by interested parties, in person, in the flesh. We're doing it live. And this is one reason why I'm very kind of almost aggressively anti-elitist in people discussing philosophy. I think there is real value in however much philosophy you've personally read or are familiar with, sitting down with other people who are just interested in these questions and just attacking it together and teasing things out. It's what it's all about, man. Or at least partly what it's all about. Now, that's another aspect of Socrates' discontent with purely written philosophy that I empathize with. And something I'd like to do on the channel, actually, is start doing kind of interviews in this kind of style where it's like a bit more, we're teasing out a question together. Just, I think, I want to tap into a bit of that. I think that's great. Also, just allows me to talk to a lot of people with other perspectives. My work is quite solitary at the moment. It's just me and a bunch of books. So I'd really enjoy that. Yeah, so I think that although I obviously disagree that philosophy should never be written down, I think that actually by reading some of the critiques that Socrates had of philosophy being written down, we can learn a little bit of what we might lose by committing too much of our brain to the outside world, if that makes sense. In a increasingly... And it sounds like so cliche to be like, in an increasingly technological world. But in an increasingly technological world where, things like AI and search engines and stuff, there is a real danger that we'll just take the path of least resistance and end up outsourcing our thinking to machines. And I think that'll be a real shame. Then again, of course I would, right? Like, I'm a philosophy student. What am I going to say? Yeah, we should outsource our thinking to other people or other things? Of course we shouldn't. But I don't know. That's my view on things. It's one of the aspects of technological advancement that actually makes me profoundly nervous. But, we'll see. We'll see how the world progresses. Maybe it'll all be fine. I don't know. I always like to be proven wrong in my pessimistic predictions for the future. So, fingers crossed. Okay, next we have a meme by a false Slim Shady, and it's two birds talking, and one of them says, "Wasn't this leaf green before?" And the other says, "Disproving religion doesn't disprove God." And the first bird says, "What?" And the second bird says, "God is not scientifically falsifiable." And the other bird says, "What?" Because presumably it's panicked by this realization. I don't know if God is in principle unfalsifiable. If you're to find like a contradiction within the properties of a given theistic conception, then yeah, you have disproven God or disproven that conception of God. I think that first bit where it says disproving religion or a particular religion doesn't disprove God is very interesting. Something I've become increasingly interested in is the amount of kind of middle grounds between atheism and theism that often kind of get overlooked in popular discourse. So one of those is just deism, the idea that there is some kind of supernatural origin to the universe, but that God ceases to be involved past the point of origin. So a deist might say something like, okay, I accept the fine-tuning argument, and I think that God does exist. He was there to set the wheels in motion, but that I don't think that he is out and about doing things, sending one part of his Trinity down to die, interfering with prophets, that kind of, a much less involved God. That was a very popular view in certain schools of ancient philosophy. I'm pretty sure that was Epicurus's view. Or if not, kind of an explicit deism. Epicurus was convinced that if gods do exist, they'd be like totally unconcerned with human affairs. In the same way that like I would be unconcerned with the affairs of like ants or, gerbils or something like that. I'm not interested in the salvation of gerbils. It's just not something that takes up a lot of my headspace. But that was kind of Epicurus's argument, is that if gods are around and they're so much greater than any mortal, then we just should expect them to be pretty disinterested in them, in us. For I too am mortal, I hope. I say I hope because I find the concept of immortality much scarier than the concept of mortality. But anyway, back to my point. Yeah, so like that would be one variant, I suppose, on something like the kind of uninvolved God of deism. Another example of kind of in-between position that isn't captured by any of the major world religions, but I think is very philosophically interesting, is something like skeptical theism. Skeptical theism is the idea that if God exists, we don't know what he would value. It might be that he would choose to tend to black holes like a garden or something again, the idea is that a God would just be so much greater than us and so incomprehensible to us that we just wouldn't be able to understand who they are or what they value. However, there is some interesting tension here, right? Because if you don't know what a God values, if you literally have no idea, then certain theistic arguments become much less easy to put forward. I actually referenced on the channel before, a very young guy, actually has his own YouTube channel called Miles K. Donahue. He actually made a response video to my fine-tuning argument video, and it was very, very good. I highly recommend checking it out. He wrote a paper that was essentially on skeptical theism, and he pointed out, I think very justifiably, that a skeptical theist can't appeal to things like the fine-tuning argument in order to justify their theism, because the fine-tuning argument rests on the idea that there's an agent who wants to create a world like ours. Whereas if you've got a skeptical theist, then they can't say there's an agent who wants to create a world like ours. I can't remember if he addresses this in his paper, but I sometimes wonder if you can extend that to things like arguments for God based on the principle of sufficient reason. Quite a lot of classical theist arguments, they're about tracing chains of dependence back to the existence of God and then grounding God as an uncaused cause, largely based on the idea of a kind of fundamental conception of agency and choice as a plausible candidate for uncaused, causey stuff. And I also wonder whether this would also be undermined by a kind of skeptical theism, because we don't know anything about God's agency or what God would desire or how God would act. But nonetheless, I remain very interested in skeptical theism. I suppose another example of an in-between position would be something like Gnosticism, where you have a kind of demiurge and a kind of spiritual higher God, but one who doesn't rule this universe. I think I find that very interesting. Partly because I sometimes wonder whether, were it not for the kind of cultural dominance of a non-Gnostic sect of Christianity, we would end up with some kind of, Zoroaster-style Gnosticism. I know, interesting. Somebody should look at alternate history stuff regarding Gnosticism. I think that'd be kind of fun. But yeah, I think that this meme does make a good point, which is that disproving particular religions doesn't disprove the theistic hypothesis. I certainly find the bare theistic hypothesis of there just being a God, but not necessarily knowing much about that God, as more plausible than the major world religions, and that's partly just a function of the fact that obviously that contains fewer propositions than the major world religions, and most of the major world religions contain this kind of minimalistic theism as a subset, which means it's going to be strictly at least as likely as all of the major world religions. I might make a video on all of these in-between standard atheism and standard major world religion theism camps. I might call it Beyond Atheism and Theism to get clicks. But anyway, let's move on. Next, we have a meme by Used Specialist 3567, and it's someone reaching towards a balloon that says Diogenes is great, and then someone grabbing them from behind saying, be like him. So Diogenes is one of those philosophers that obviously has loads of anecdotes about him that are very cool, and he is a very interesting thinker to talk about. I think that cynicism itself is a deeply interesting philosophy. Cynicism is also one of the most demanding philosophies of the ancient world. I mean, all ancient philosophies are pretty demanding. Epicureanism asks you to live in what most people would say is pretty extreme moderation, which for them would just be regular moderation. But, in a kind of modern context, we have access to a lot more luxuries. This would probably come across as quite an ascetic lifestyle. Someone like the Stoics, if you look in Stoicism, it is quite demanding. It asks quite a lot of you, both in your everyday practice and also just in terms of your kind of metaphysical view of the universe. But cynicism demands an absurd amount of you. You think about what Diogenes does. Diogenes only wears a cloak. He has a staff. He lives in a big ceramic jar. One of the misconceptions about Diogenes is he lives in a barrel. They didn't really have barrels in the same way that barrel, I think just barrels were a later invention, or either they didn't have them in Athens / Corinth at the time. He lived in this big kind of mason jar. But he has no possessions. He actually, one of the stories about him is that he has a bowl and he's, dipping the bowl in a bit of water to then drink the water. And then he sees I think it's either a man or a child or a dog. Something is just lapping it up with its hands or with its tongue. And in response to this, Diogenes smashes the bowl and starts just saying, oh God, I didn't even need the bowl. I could just use my hands to do it. And, very few people choose or want to live like that. I'm reminded of this, I think her name is Hipparchia, this kind of noble-born Greek woman who just became a cynic and literally gave up everything her potentially materially comfortable lifestyle could have allowed her to have. I think the legend goes, at least, that her parents asked the cynic philosopher that she'd become a kind of follower and later the wife of, or at least the partner of. They asked him to kind of try and talk her out of this. And he tried. He was like, yeah, this is such a demanding lifestyle. You're going to have to give up all of your material possessions. You're going to be constantly uncomfortable. And that's the point. You're literally going to live like a dog. That's where the word cynic comes from. And she's just completely unswayed. I think this is a phenomenon that stretches quite a long way beyond cynicism, though. A lot of philosophies demand quite a lot of you. I think the paramount or the prime example of this, I suppose, is Christianity. There are over 1 billion Christians in the world. I don't know if there are over 2 billion, but there are definitely over 1 billion. We sometimes forget, as in, well, I'm not a Christian myself, but I think that the Christians sometimes forget just how demanding the Bible is. The New Testament is an incredibly demanding text. I'm always reminded of the quote by, I've forgotten his name, that's really embarrassing. What's this? It's not C.S. Lewis, it's the other guy. He wrote Orthodoxy. G.K. Chesterton, that's it, of course. G.K. Chesterton said, Christianity has not been tried but found wanting. Christianity has never been tried. And there's an argument that if following a philosophy means following the canonical text of that philosophy or the kind of stated axioms of that philosophy to the letter, then yeah, Christianity probably has never been tried. Is it Nietzsche who said that there was one true Christian and he was executed on the cross, or is that someone else? There's this theme in a lot of literature about the idea that Christ was the only person that ever lived up to the Christian ideal, and there might be something in that. Food for thought. Next, we have a meme by Selim's Bonozo, and it's a guy doing the peace sign and then disappearing. And it reads, my newly acquired understanding of philosophy after 2 days. I think that pretty much every philosophy student or philosophy enthusiast or even philosopher has been here at some point. It's very easy to either, this manifests in 2 ways, I think. First of all, you can think that you've made sense of something and then, the next day you read it again and you realize that your interpretation was probably wrong. This happens to me all the time, right? I've been doing YouTube philosophy videos kind of in a relatively serious way for like a couple of years now. Well, not quite a couple of years, but coming up to a couple of years. And I know, I look back at my old videos and I think, oh God, that was awful. Either because I don't think that I struck the right balance between simplifying something down so that it's not kind of getting lost in an academic quagmire, or so I think that I've kind of simplified things too much, and I'm not necessarily happy with how I've covered some subjects in the past, like thinking like November 2023, that kind of time. Or alternatively, my view has just changed. I will look back at how I read Nietzsche or Kierkegaard 2 years ago and just think, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about how I interpreted this passage or that passage, or I've read a lot more secondary literature since then, so it just kind of, I cringe a bit, I cringe at my old self. And I feel like, a lot of philosophy students have that experience because, well, hopefully my thinking on this is that I like to think that experience is ultimately quite a good thing, because hopefully that means that I'm learning in some sense. It means that in some way, my interpretations are getting more sophisticated over time rather than less sophisticated. And I imagine that in a few years, I will look back on my interpretations and philosophies now and think, oh, maybe there was something in there, but that really needed refining, and that wasn't doing justice to this thinker, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can only hope that I'm kind of going in the right direction, I guess. But this is just a kind of public example of something that I think happens to almost everyone who's interested in philosophy, which is that your interpretation changes over time, The other experience, which I also think is pretty universal, is that there are things that at one point you knew that you then go back and read and you think, oh God, how did I ever really understand this? I think this isn't just limited to philosophy. One of my friends works for a long time in general relativity theory and now works elsewhere, as in another field of physics. And he says that he sometimes goes back and reads like old papers from his old field that he'd sunk, years and years of his life into. And at the time he understood. And he just goes, God, I couldn't make heads or tails of that now. And I think that my version of that is something like the proofs behind Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Because at one point I could honestly say that, like, yeah, no, I understand this. I can actually recreate this. And now if I tried to do that, I just wouldn't be able to. I want to, at some point, do a video on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So I need to go back and reread my own notes from like 3 years ago and try and make sense of it, as well as kind of revisiting Gödel's original proof, but also the proof that has been kind of refined from Gödel's original version. Partly because Gödel's original version is dealing with the proof system of Principia Mathematica, which is not the same thing as proof systems that we have today. So when people present them now, they tend to alter it slightly, and they tend to refine bits and shorten bits using more modern proof methods or steps that we've learned how to do more elegantly over time, since Gödel, I mean. And yeah, if I want to do that, I will have to go back and relearn something that at some point I was very confident using and talking about and discussing the philosophical implications of. And, I think that most philosophy students have had that experience as well. Oh, another good example is the Tractatus. So, I spent so long trying to unpick the Tractatus using like loads and loads of secondary literature. This is when I was at university. And I got to a point where I was like, oh yeah, I think I grasp this now. And I went back and reread it. And what I hope has happened is that I think my interpretation then was naive and it's moved on in that kind of learning process that I discussed in the first half of me yapping about this meme. And what I am profoundly worried about is that actually what's happened is that I just have lost that understanding, and I need to kind of graft to recuperate it. Because that's another video I'd like to do at some point. I'd like to do a video on the Tractatus, but the Tractatus is A, very difficult to understand, B, highly disputed. Wittgenstein is one of the few philosophers in the analytic tradition that's probably as disputed as, in terms of how to interpret him, as some of the continental giants like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and aspects of Schopenhauer and Choran and Mainlander and stuff. Wittgenstein is an interpretive beast in a way that a lot of analytic philosophers thankfully aren't. And so I want, A, it's kind of, it's difficult to understand, and B, it's hard to do justice in a script to this kind of the breadth of plausible interpretations. Now, I'll probably hopefully resolve that by basically just reminding people that there are a breadth of interpretations out there, and then just going with one, because otherwise the video will be like 12 hours long. But also, C, it's quite tricky to get something as dry and dense as the Tractatus into a format that I think will really hook people. I'm very interested in, getting people interested in philosophy. I want people to hopefully get the impression that philosophy is not just this kind of dry academic discipline. It's very helpful either for achieving clarity of thought, or to genuinely use in a first order way in your own life. And this video is going to be one of the ones that's just in the works for ages, and it's going to take me forever to do. But I want to do it well. But yeah, I think that broadly this is a very relatable meme. And, if you've ever had this same experience, just know that you're not alone. Philosophy, in a lot of ways, isn't a linear process of gradually acquiring more knowledge and more understanding and more philosophical aptitude, whatever that means. It's more like a kind of stepwise function that also goes down from time to time. And, sometimes you just have to rebuild your own understanding of a philosopher from the ground up. Next, we have a meme by Traditional Depth 6924, and it's Fred from the Scooby-Doo gang unmasking a villain, and the villain is analytic philosophy, and it says, "Let's see who you really are," and the mask is taken away, and it's revealed to be collective linguistic OCD. This is a critique that lots of people level at analytic philosophy, and I think that there's something in it, but I'm going to defend it anyway. The analytic philosophy obsession with the idea of precision and of defining terms and of outlining every single step of the argument that you give is incredibly helpful. People talk about philosophy as a means to improve the state of your own thinking, like improving the process of thinking. And I think that analytic philosophy is incredibly helpful for that because, for example, I'll tell you a story from my time at university. I gave in an essay on something, because at Cambridge you have to write like 1 or 2 essays a week, which is one of the reasons why I write videos at about a kind of once per week, sometimes twice per week scripted pace for the channel. It's because I'm just continuing a habit from university. But I once handed in this essay and my supervisor gave it back to me, and like the only notes that he had, he just circled words and then put an arrow and then just went define ? Because I hadn't defined them properly. And then at the end of the essay, he just put at the bottom I don't know what any of this means. And I had the discussion with him, and he was like, look, Joe, what you've got to understand about the process of writing philosophy in the analytic tradition, in this style, is that you've got to try and make it so that there are as few potentials for being misunderstood as humanly possible. And that's a high bar to jump over, but the idea is that you get closer and closer to that idea. No, that conversation has always kind of stuck with me. It's something that I try to do in my scripts. I mean, the interesting thing about somebody who's, as I have, gone from a kind of really quite hardcore analytic tradition and is now much more open to continental philosophers, is that, I say, they write in very different styles. Continental philosophers tend to write in a much more florid and potentially a much more poetic style. They're often much more pleasant to read on a sort of visceral level. At the same time, they tend to lend themselves to a much wider range of plausible interpretations. It's not always quite as clear what exactly they mean. There are whole disciplines around these thinkers attempting to draw out their thoughts and find the most plausible interpretations of them. And, that's something that isn't as big a deal in analytic philosophy, partly because there is this tradition of kind of an obsessive level of precision. And, my dream, and I think I've spoken this on the channel before, my absolute dream style of philosophy is a kind of philosophy that's bold enough to tackle a lot of the questions that continental philosophers want to tackle, things like questions of meaning and the kind of questions that blend together concerns of human emotion and social organization and ethics and language and thought and mind and intersubjectivity and existential anguish, and kind of treating them all at the same time. It's like it's such an admirable thing for a philosopher to attempt to do. And I've really come to appreciate that aspect of parts of the continental tradition. I would love for there to be kind of modern philosophers that approach those questions as ambitiously, but had a manner of presentation that was very, very analytic. I actually think, and there are philosophers in the early 20th century that I think sometimes do this. I mean, arguably, the Tractatus was an attempt to solve philosophy in this kind of like incredibly ambitious way. But again, as I said earlier in the video, that does lend itself to a whole series of interpretations. So maybe that's not the best example. I know that's kind of like, I don't know if it can be done is one thing, because I was speaking to somebody who was both kind of, whose background is in pure continental philosophy. And I was once saying to this friend, I wish that some of this was written in an analytic style while not losing the passion for this grandeur of question, if that makes sense. And he put it to me that actually the style is inseparable from the question. It might just be that in order to tackle that level of topic all at once in the manner of, say, a Nietzsche or a Heidegger, you need to write in a slightly more poetic style, maybe, because you're trying to get at something that, actually, he had a really nice way of putting this. He said that, in his opinion, a lot of continental philosophers are trying to get at something that is almost at the edge of effability, and they're trying to put that into words. I know, and I think that's noble. I hold out hope that we can end up with the best of both the continental and the analytic traditions. But I do agree that sometimes the level of precision of analytic philosophy might come across as frustrating. But I would defend that as actually one of its key strengths. I quite often recommend reading Frege on the channel. Frege's largely concerned with questions of maths and logic and language, but and these are questions that I really care about, but a lot of people don't. One of the reasons why I recommend reading him, even if you're not necessarily interested in the questions that he spent his whole life obsessing over, is because the manner in which he approaches all of it is so precise that it kind of, it ends up hopefully rubbing off on your own thinking. So yes, no, I'm a big fan of analytic philosophy, linguistic obsessive compulsive disorder, as this poster has put it, and all. Right, that's all we have time for today. If you want to check out one of my other casual videos, I've got a very long, quite fun iceberg video right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.